At dawn on June 24, 1941, the road east of Razyniai was already clogged with wreckage. Burned-out trucks lay nose to tail in the ditches, their canvas tops shredded by shrapnel. Dead horses stiffened in harness. German infantry picked their way forward in silence, stepping over twisted metal and the bodies of men who had not expected resistance here, not on this scale, not this early. Somewhere ahead, unseen in the morning haze, a single Soviet heavy tank sat astride the road, immobile, scarred, and still alive. It had been hit repeatedly. Its tracks were damaged. Its radio was likely dead. The crew inside had been fighting for hours without resupply, without contact, and without any clear understanding of the larger battle. They were, in every operational sense, broken, and yet nothing moved past them. This was the opening week of Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. 3 million Axis troops had crossed into the Soviet Union under the assumption that speed would substitute for strategy and shock would replace planning. German armored divisions were expected to race forward, rupture Soviet defenses, and collapse the Red Army before it could reorganize. The road network of Lithuania was supposed to be a conduit for that momentum. Instead, it became a choke point. What confronted the advancing German forces was not a grand defensive line or a coordinated counterattack. It was a lone Soviet KV series heavy tank, one of a handful operating in the area, cut off from its unit, likely low on ammunition, certainly isolated. German reports later struggled to explain how a single vehicle could halt an entire regimental column, disrupt supply lines, and force repeated assaults by infantry, artillery, and anti-tank guns. The answer lay not in legend, but in the collision between assumptions and reality. The KV-1 was a shock to German planners. Its armor could shrug off the standard 37 anti-tank guns that formed the backbone of German defensive doctrine. At Razyniai, round after round bounced off its hull, leaving chalky scars but no penetration. Infantry attacks failed. Satchel charges were placed at night, sometimes inches from the steel, sometimes under fire, often with fatal results. The tank remained. By mid-morning, German commanders were diverting resources meant for the advance to deal with a single obstacle. Ammunition convoys backed up. Fuel trucks waited. Orders stacked atop orders, all subordinate to the same grim reality. The road was closed, not by a division, not by a fortified line, by one crew in one damaged tank. This was not heroism as later myth would frame it. There was no speech, no dramatic last stand. The Soviet crew had no way of knowing the effect they were having. They fired when targets appeared. They conserved ammunition when they could. They endured heat, smoke, concussion, and the knowledge that no relief was coming. Their resistance was not symbolic. It was mechanical, procedural, and brutally immediate. German losses accumulated in increments rather than explosions. Vehicles abandoned. Guns knocked out. Men killed while attempting flanking maneuvers that terrain did not allow. Time bled away. In mobile warfare, time is not a neutral factor. It compounds error. Every hour lost to this single tank rippled outward, interfering with synchronization between units and exposing the fragility of plans built on speed. The broader context was unforgiving. German armored divisions in this sector were already operating at the edge of their logistical reach. Soviet forces, though disorganized, were beginning to counterattack piecemeal. Communications faltered. Maps proved inadequate. In this environment, the immobilized KV-1 became something more than a tactical nuisance. It was a stress fracture in the invasion itself. When the tank was finally destroyed, after direct fire from heavy artillery at close range, the road reopened. But the damage was done. The German division moving through Razyniai would not recover its tempo. It would face further resistance, mounting casualties, and an erosion of confidence that no after-action report could fully capture. This channel, WW2 Breakdown, exists to examine moments like this without varnish or legend. where human endurance, flawed machines, and strategic overconfidence collide with consequences that outlast the battlefield. The story of that broken crew does not end with the smoking hull left by the roadside. It continues through the unraveling of an entire campaign, through decisions made far from the front, and through the lives altered by a delay measured first in hours, then in years. The road at Razyni was never meant to matter. On German operational maps, it was a thin line among hundreds, a logistical artery rather than a battlefield. The real decisions, the decisive battles, were supposed to occur far to the east, after the Soviet frontier armies collapsed. That assumption framed everything the German command believed about June 1941, and it was already failing. Operation Barbarossa was built on speed as doctrine and ideology as strategy. German planners assumed the Red Army would fracture under the initial shock, its command structure too brittle, its officer corps too damaged by Stalin's purges to adapt. Armored spearheads would push forward relentlessly, leaving pockets of resistance to be mopped up by infantry. The war, Hitler promised, would be finished before winter. What he did not plan for was delay. Not delay on the scale of weeks or months, but delay measured in hours that multiplied into systemic failure. Army Group North's advance through Lithuania exposed those weaknesses early. German panzer divisions were stretched thin, operating beyond reliable supply lines, dependent on roads never designed for sustained mechanized traffic. Fuel consumption exceeded projections. Maintenance units lagged behind. Radios crackled with fragmentary reports that made coordination fragile. The invasion force moved fast, but it moved blind. The Soviet response was chaotic, but not inert. Despite catastrophic losses in the opening days, local commanders launched counterattacks with whatever forces remained intact. Heavy tanks like the KV-1 were not meant to operate alone. They were part of larger formations that were often destroyed or scattered by airstrikes and encirclements. When these machines appeared unexpectedly, unsupported and out of contact, they created problems German doctrine was not prepared to solve. At Razyni, the isolated KV was not following a grand plan. It was the residue of collapse. Its presence on that road was the product of fragmentation, not coordination. Yet fragmentation did not equal irrelevance. The German army depended on assumptions of predictability. That resistance would be either overwhelming and identifiable or negligible and bypassable. The KV was neither. German anti-tank doctrine emphasized mobility and rapid engagement. The standard 37 gun, dismissively nicknamed the door knocker by its crews, had been effective against Polish and French armor. Against the KV's thick frontal armor, it was useless. Artillery units were not positioned for direct fire. Air support was unavailable at the moment it was needed. Commanders faced a choice between improvisation and paralysis. Improvisation carried its own costs. Infantry assaults exposed soldiers to machine gun fire at close range. Engineers crawled forward under fire to place explosives, often without clear instruction on where to place them for effect. Each failed attempt produced casualties that accumulated silently, reported later in sterile language that concealed the human reality. These were not dramatic losses. They were men killed one by one, in the shadow of a single steel hull. Strategically, the delay at Razyni intersected with larger miscalculations. German planners underestimated Soviet industrial capacity and overestimated the fragility of Soviet morale. They believed that decapitation, destroying frontline units and capturing territory, would trigger political collapse. Instead, Soviet command absorbed losses and continued to generate resistance, uneven but persistent. The heavy tank at Razyni was not an aberration. It was an early symptom. The German High Command, distant from the roadblock, interpreted delays as local inefficiencies rather than structural warnings. Reports moved upwards stripped of urgency. The tank became an anecdote rather than an indictment. No doctrine was revised. No assumptions were challenged. The invasion continued forward, carrying its blind spots with it. For the Soviet side, the moment passed without recognition. The crew inside the KV was unlikely to be named in official dispatches. Their action did not alter orders or inspire propaganda in real time. It existed only as resistance enacted under pressure, disconnected from outcome or reward. That anonymity mattered. It stripped the event of hero narrative and left only consequence. The war would move on, swallowing roads and towns with indifferent scale. But the conditions that allowed one broken crew to disrupt an armored division, overconfidence, logistical fragility, and doctrinal rigidity, would recur. At Razinyai, those forces met in compressed form, revealing how quickly a campaign built on certainty could be unsettled by a single point of friction. The road reopened, the column moved forward, and the invasion carried with it the unexamined cost of having been stopped at all. The delay did not announce itself with sirens or alarms. It crept outward through the German column in small, corrosive ways. Fuel trucks idled longer than planned. Artillery pieces waited for orders that did not come. Battalion commanders argued over maps that no longer reflected reality. In the absence of clear information, rumor filled the gaps, and uncertainty began to shape decisions. German intelligence in the opening weeks of Barbarossa was already collapsing under its own assumptions. Pre-war estimates had severely underestimated the number of Soviet armored vehicles and the resilience of Soviet industry. When heavy tanks appeared unexpectedly, they were often misidentified, their capabilities guessed at rather than understood. At Razinyai, reports described a new type of tank with armor impervious to standard weapons. The implication was disturbing, but it remained localized, easy to dismiss as an anomaly. This was how systemic failure takes root, not through dramatic shocks, but through manageable-seeming exceptions that accumulate. The KV's presence forced German units to divert anti-aircraft guns for ground fire, a tactic that worked but required time, coordination, and exposure. While crews prepared these weapons, Soviet forces elsewhere regrouped, withdrew, or counterattacked. The German timetable slipped incrementally, and with it, the illusion of control. Logistics strained further. Ammunition expenditure at Razinyai exceeded expectations, particularly specialized rounds in short supply. Repair units struggled to keep up with vehicles damaged not by enemy fire, but by overuse and poor roads. Horses died from exhaustion, reducing transport capacity for units already operating at the edge of sustainability. These were not headline failures. They were the quiet arithmetic of attrition. Moral compromise accompanied operational stress. German units, under pressure to maintain momentum, treated civilians with increasing suspicion and brutality. Lithuanian towns along the advance route became zones of fear, where accusations of partisan activity justified reprisals. The war's ideological framework, one that dehumanized entire populations, made restraint unlikely. Delays amplified that violence as frustration sought release. For the Soviet side, chaos was no less severe. Units were shattered, commanders killed or cut off, and communications unreliable. Yet even in this disarray, resistance persisted. The KV crew at Razinyai operated without guidance, but they were not unique in their isolation. Across the front, small groups fought independently, sometimes effectively, often at terrible cost. The Red Army was bleeding, but it was not dissolving. The tank itself became a focal point for German frustration. Its continued presence challenged not just tactics, but identity. The Wehrmacht had built its self-image on technical superiority and operational brilliance. Being halted by a single enemy vehicle, immobile, damaged, and silent for long stretches, was an affront to that narrative. The response was escalation rather than reflection. As hours passed, German commanders authorized increasingly risky approaches. Infantry advanced closer. Guns were repositioned under fire. Casualties mounted, recorded later as numbers without context. Each death represented a choice made under uncertainty, shaped by the imperative to move forward at all costs. The tank did not need to destroy an armored division outright. It only needed to force it to reveal its vulnerabilities. Intelligence failures compounded the problem. German aerial reconnaissance did not prioritize the area once the tank was identified as isolated. The assumption remained that larger Soviet formations were already broken. This misreading allowed Soviet counterattacks elsewhere to gain limited traction, enough to disrupt coordination between German units. The front became uneven, jagged with friction points like Rasinyi. The psychological toll was asymmetric. The Soviet crew, enclosed in steel, faced imminent death with a clarity that stripped away abstraction. Their world narrowed to targets, ammunition counts, and the oppressive heat inside the hull. The German soldiers outside experienced a different strain, repeated exposure to danger without progress, a sense of impotence against an enemy that would not yield. Both forms of stress were corrosive. By the time the tank was finally neutralized, the surrounding German units were already behind schedule. Orders from higher command pressed them forward, indifferent to the cause of delay. There was no pause for assessment, no recalibration. The invasion machine rolled on, carrying with it the lessons it refused to learn. Rasinyi faded into reports and footnotes, but the conditions it revealed, intelligence blind spots, logistical fragility, and moral erosion under pressure, were now embedded in the campaign. The roadblock had been cleared. The damage remained. The destruction of the tank did not resolve the contradictions it had exposed. When German artillery finally silenced the KV at close range, the moment was not marked by celebration. The wreck sat twisted at the roadside, its armor split and blackened, the crew inside killed without ceremony. There was no time to inspect the remains, no opportunity to absorb what had happened. Orders were already pressing the column forward, and momentum, however diminished, had to be reclaimed. The decision to resume the advance without reassessment was itself a turning point. German commanders on the ground understood that something had gone wrong, but the structure of command left little space for adaptation. Barbarossa was not designed to absorb friction. It was designed to overwhelm it. When resistance appeared outside expectations, the response was to push harder rather than to rethink. This rigidity extended upward. Higher headquarters interpreted the delay as a localized problem, resolved once the obstacle was destroyed. There was no mechanism for translating tactical shock into strategic adjustment. Reports emphasized eventual success, not the cost or the implications. The KV became evidence of Soviet desperation rather than Soviet capability. That interpretation would prove consequential. Meanwhile, Soviet command faced its own set of grim decisions. Counterattacks like the one that placed the KV on the Rasinyi Road were often launched with incomplete information and inadequate support. Heavy tanks were committed piecemeal, their crews sent into combat without infantry cover or air protection. These choices reflected both desperation and doctrine, a belief that aggressive action could slow the German advance even at high cost. The result was resistance that was tactically isolated but strategically disruptive. For the soldiers involved, decision-making narrowed to survival and duty. German infantry units advancing past the destroyed tank encountered the aftermath of the delay. Abandoned vehicles, hastily dug grave, the lingering smell of burned fuel and flesh. These sights did not inspire reflection. They hardened resolve and deepened detachment. The war was already stripping away nuance. The KV crew's last hours illustrated the asymmetry of agency in modern warfare. They could not alter orders or influence strategy. Their decisions were immediate and constrained: when to fire, when to conserve, when to endure. Yet the effects of those decisions propagated far beyond the hull of their tank. German units adjusted timetables. Supply chains faltered. Coordination with neighboring divisions weakened. None of this was visible from inside the steel enclosure. As the advance resumed, German armored units encountered further resistance, less dramatic but more widespread. Soviet forces fell back, regrouped, and struck opportunistically. Bridges were destroyed. Roads were cratered. The terrain itself became an adversary. Each obstacle compounded the others, and the cumulative effect began to strain the invasion's coherence. Moral choices continued to degrade under pressure. Civilians suspected of aiding Soviet forces were detained or killed. Entire communities were subjected to collective punishment. These actions were not aberrations. They were facilitated by ideology and accelerated by frustration. The delay at Razyny did not cause these crimes, but it intensified the conditions under which they occurred. Within the German ranks, confidence shifted subtly. The belief in effortless victory gave way to a more brittle determination. Officers demanded results. Soldiers complied, often without understanding the broader picture. The war became a sequence of tasks rather than a campaign with an end point. In this environment, reflection was a liability. For the Soviet side, the cost was staggering. Tank crews like the one at Razyny were expended at a rate that defied sustainability. Losses were accepted as necessary to buy time, to slow an enemy whose strength lay in momentum. That time would later prove decisive, but in June 1941, it was purchased with lives that would remain largely unrecorded. The turning point was not the tank's destruction, but the refusal to learn from it. German commanders pressed on, convinced that setbacks were temporary and that ultimate success remained inevitable. The Soviet command, equally constrained, continued to trade men and machines for delay. Both sides moved forward along paths narrowed by their own assumptions. The road east of Razyny disappeared behind the advancing column, but the choices made there followed it. They shaped the next engagements, the next delays, and the next grave. The war was no longer unfolding as planned, and yet no one was prepared to admit it. The war did not pause for those left behind on the road. After the column moved on, civilians emerged cautiously from cellars and tree lines, drawn by the silence. They found burned vehicles stripped of anything usable, shallow grave marked with helmets or wooden boards, and the wreck of the tank itself, still radiating heat. There were no announcements, no explanations, only evidence that the world they knew had been crushed between forces that did not see them. For the families living near Razyny, the tank was not a symbol of resistance or technological shock. It was a magnet for violence. German units searched homes, questioned men of fighting age, and requisitioned food already scarce. Fear spread faster than information. People learned to measure danger by sound, the distant thud of artillery, the abrupt crack of rifle fire, the silence that followed. Survival became procedural. Hide, wait, endure. Among the German soldiers who had faced the tank, the experience settled unevenly. Some spoke later of frustration and disbelief, of rounds bouncing harmlessly away. Others remembered the smell of burned explosives and the sight of comrades killed at close range. There was no shared language for what they had encountered. Official records reduced it to an obstacle overcome. Personal memory resisted that simplification. Medics worked continuously in the wake of the delay. Wounds sustained during repeated assaults were often severe, the result of close engagement and shrapnel. Supplies ran short. Triage became ruthless. Those who could be stabilized were evacuated west. Those who could not were sedated if possible and left behind. The medical system was already strained by the pace of the advance, and moments like Razyny pushed it closer to collapse. Soviet prisoners captured in subsequent days carried their own silence. Many had been cut off, fighting without orders until ammunition ran out. They moved east to west under guard, hungry, exhausted, uncertain of their fate. Some may have passed the wreck of the KV without knowing who crewed it or what it had done. The war fragmented experience so thoroughly that even acts of extraordinary consequence could pass unnoticed by those living alongside them. The families of the tank crew would not receive a clear account of their deaths. Notification, if it came at all, would be delayed and vague. Names might be misspelled, circumstances obscured. In the Soviet system, individual sacrifice was absorbed into collective narrative, and even that narrative lagged behind reality. For those waiting at home, uncertainty became permanent. German soldiers wrote letters when they could, careful with language, aware of censorship, and of their own limited understanding. Some described resistance that was stronger than expected. Others avoided detail altogether. What could not be explained was the sense that the war was already heavier than promised, more resistant to momentum than doctrine allowed. These impressions accumulated privately, rarely shared. Civilians in nearby towns learned quickly that visibility invited danger. Windows were shuttered. Movement was restricted to early morning or dusk. The front line was fluid, but violence was constant. Rumors of mass killings elsewhere filtered through in fragments, unconfirmed but believable. The ideological war that accompanied the military one was no longer abstract. The tank's presence had concentrated destruction, but its absence did not bring relief. As German units advanced, new confrontations replaced old ones. Soviet counterattacks flared and collapsed. Retreating forces destroyed infrastructure, leaving civilians without bridges, mills, or power. The landscape became a record of choices made under pressure, each scar marking a calculation of necessity over mercy. For the soldiers who moved past Razyniai, the memory of the delay lingered as a warning without a lesson. They had seen that resistance could appear anywhere, that superiority was conditional. Yet the structure of the war did not reward caution. Orders demanded speed. Speed demanded risk. Risk demanded lives. The human cost of the tank's stand could not be isolated to those who fought it directly. It extended outward to families displaced, prisoners marched away, medics overwhelmed, and communities forced into complicity or silence. These consequences did not end when the road reopened. They followed the advance eastward, accumulating with each kilometer, shaping a war that was already losing any pretense of control. In this way, the broken crew's impact was not confined to a battlefield moment. It was carried forward in altered lives, in choices constrained by fear and exhaustion, and in a widening circle of loss that no after-action report could contain. As the summer advanced, the German timetable grew increasingly abstract. Maps still showed arrows thrusting east, but the lived reality was a sequence of collisions between intention and exhaustion. Units that had expected to refuel and refit instead fought continuously, their vehicles wearing down faster than they could be repaired. The delay at Razyniai had not halted the invasion, but it had helped expose how thin the margin truly was. German armored divisions now advanced with a heightened sense of vulnerability. Commanders pushed reconnaissance farther ahead, not out of confidence, but out of fear of another unseen obstruction. Each wooded bend in the road carried the possibility of ambush. Heavy Soviet tanks, once considered rare anomalies, were now anticipated threats, even when they did not materialize. Anticipation itself became a burden, slowing decisions and sharpening nerves. Supply columns lagged. Fuel shortages forced units to pause or siphon from disabled vehicles. Ammunition stocks fluctuated unpredictably, leaving some formations overstocked and others dangerously exposed. The German system had been designed for short, decisive campaigns, not prolonged friction. Every unplanned engagement amplified strain, and Razyniai had been a primer in unplanned resistance. Soviet forces, though battered, exploited this strain unevenly but persistently. Counterattacks were often poorly coordinated and costly, yet they achieved their primary objective: buying time. Time for factories east of the Urals to relocate. Time for reserves to mobilize. Time for command structures to adapt under fire. The KV crews stand fit into this broader pattern of delay through sacrifice, a strategy that valued endurance over preservation. The escalation toward climax was not a single crescendo, but a grinding convergence. German units pressed forward under orders that tolerated no hesitation. Soviet defenders absorbed losses and regrouped, learning where German assumptions could be exploited. The front became a series of jagged encounters rather than a clean breakthrough. Each side adjusted incrementally, constrained by ideology and necessity. Within German ranks, fatigue deepened into attrition of morale. Casualties were no longer shocking, they were expected. Replacement troops arrived with less training, thrown into formations already stretched thin. Veterans carried the memory of Razinyi as a reference point, a reminder that superiority was conditional and reversible. Yet there was no institutional space to articulate that doubt. The moral landscape continued to erode. Anti-partisan operations expanded, often targeting civilians indiscriminately. Villages suspected of resistance were burned. Hostages were taken and executed. These actions were justified internally as security measures, but they also reflected a loss of strategic patience. Violence became both tool and outlet, masking structural weakness behind terror. For Soviet soldiers and civilians, the escalation was existential. Retreat meant abandonment of homes and livelihoods. Resistance meant near-certain death. Many were caught between orders to hold and the reality of overwhelming firepower. The war compressed choice into extremes, leaving little room for agency beyond endurance. The memory of isolated stands like Razinyi circulated informally, fragments of reassurance that resistance mattered, even if survival did not follow. As summer wore on, weather and distance compounded strain. Dust clogged engines. Heat exhausted men already underfed. Medical services on both sides faltered under the volume of wounded. The human body became another logistical constraint, one that could not be resupplied as easily as fuel or ammunition. The escalation did not announce itself as a turning point. There was no single battle that marked the shift. Instead, it manifested as a creeping recognition among German commanders that the campaign was not unfolding as planned. Timetables slipped. Objectives were redefined. The promise of decisive victory receded into conditional optimism. The broken crew stand had been an early collision, a localized convergence of plans and reality. Now, that collision expanded across the front. German forces encountered resistance that was less spectacular but more pervasive. Soviet losses remained staggering, but they were no longer strategically meaningless. Each delay accumulated, each sacrifice added weight. By late summer, the invasion had crossed a threshold. Momentum still existed, but it was contested, fragile, and increasingly expensive. The roadblocks were no longer singular, they were systemic, and the war that had begun with confidence now advanced toward a climax shaped not by triumph, but by exhaustion, miscalculation, and the irreversible cost of having underestimated an enemy willing to endure anything to slow the advance. The climax did not arrive as a sudden reversal. It arrived as collapse layered atop persistence, a moment when accumulated strain broke the illusion of control without delivering resolution. German armored units continued to advance, but their movements were now reactive rather than commanding, shaped by shortages, resistance, and the narrowing options imposed by distance and time. In the sector that had pushed past Razinyi, the consequences converged. Units that should have been synchronized drifted out of alignment. Infantry lagged behind armor. Artillery support arrived late or not at all. The operational rhythm that had defined earlier victories was gone, replaced by improvisation under pressure. German commanders still spoke in the language of momentum, but the reality on the ground contradicted them daily. Soviet resistance intensified not because it had become stronger in absolute terms, but because it had become more deliberate. Lessons were absorbed quickly and brutally. Heavy tanks were positioned to cover key routes. Anti-tank defenses were layered where possible. Even when formations were destroyed, They forced German units to expend time and ammunition they could not replace easily. The front became a contest of depletion rather than maneuver. The pivotal confrontations that followed lacked spectacle. They were marked instead by exhaustion and inevitability. German assaults succeeded tactically, seizing ground at enormous cost. Soviet defenders withdrew or were annihilated, leaving behind scorched terrain and mass grave. Victory and defeat blurred at the human level. Both sides experienced the same heat, hunger, and fear. The difference lay in strategic depth, one side advancing into it, the other retreating through it. For German soldiers, the climax was internal. Confidence eroded into compulsion. Orders were followed not because they promised success, but because there was no alternative. The memory of early obstacles like the tank at Razyni became part of a larger realization. The war was not going to end quickly, and nothing in their training had prepared them for what that meant. Fatigue hollowed out discipline. Violence hardened into routine. The Soviet cost was catastrophic. Entire units were destroyed to delay advances measured in kilometers. Civilians fled eastward in waves, carrying what they could, abandoning the rest. Families were separated, often permanently. Cities and villages disappeared behind the front, transformed into logistical problems or ideological targets. The war consumed lives at a scale that defied comprehension, yet demanded constant participation. The confrontation between plans and reality reached its breaking point as German forces pushed deeper into territory that could not be controlled with the resources available. Supply lines stretched beyond repair. Vehicles broke down faster than they could be fixed. Horses collapsed in harness. Men marched on blistered feet, their bodies failing under cumulative strain. The campaign's logic had inverted. Success created new vulnerabilities faster than it resolved old ones. There was no moment of triumph when Soviet resistance finally gave way. There was only movement through emptiness and ruin. The German advance continued, but it did so stripped of certainty, haunted by the knowledge that each kilometer gained came at a cost that could not be recovered. The enemy had not collapsed. It had absorbed the blow and continued to fight. In this context, the earlier stand of a broken tank crew took on a grim clarity. It was not decisive in isolation. It did not destroy an armored division outright. Its power lay in exposure, revealing how easily the invasion's assumptions could be disrupted, how vulnerable speed was to friction, how human endurance could undermine mechanical superiority. The climax was not a single battle or a single loss. It was the moment when the German invasion ceased to be a controlled operation and became a war of attrition it was not equipped to win. That realization did not stop the fighting. It did not reverse the advance, but it altered the trajectory irrevocably. The road east remained open, littered with the remnants of both armies. The machinery of war rolled forward, but the outcome was no longer predetermined by doctrine or confidence. It was now shaped by endurance, loss, and the quiet, cumulative impact of resistance that refused to disappear. When the smoke finally cleared, the battlefield was a scene of quiet devastation. Vehicles lay overturned, their twisted frames a testament not to heroics, but to the relentless arithmetic of attrition. Artillery shells had cratered the terrain, roads were impassable in sections, strewn with debris. Dead horses, abandoned wagons and bodies, both German and Soviet, littered the fields. There was no triumphant announcement, no ceremonial marking, only the lingering weight of absence. Casualties were staggering, but understated in official reports. The Germans counted losses in tanks and men, yet these figures failed to convey the depth of disruption or the human suffering embedded in every statistic. Wounded soldiers, some barely able to drag themselves to cover, lay in silence until medics could reach them, often hours later. Soviet casualties were even harder to document. Many had been consumed by the landscape itself, buried in hastily dug grave or left where they fell. Each death was a deliberate consequence of choices made under duress. The survivors bore more than physical wounds. Fatigue, terror, and shock accumulated in layers that would outlast the campaign. German soldiers carried the memory of failed attacks against a single tank, of repeated exposure to fire, of comrades killed for no strategic gain. Soviet soldiers who had endured, escaped, or been captured lived with guilt and trauma that no propaganda could assuage. Their experience was measured in the erosion of spirit, in the understanding that endurance often demanded the impossible. Civilians were caught in the crossfire of consequence. Homes were burned or requisitioned. Food was scarce. Refugees moved in long columns, traveling under threat from both advancing and retreating forces. Villages became transitory shelters, filled with the injured, the homeless, and the mourning. The human geography of the front shifted with every engagement, leaving behind communities broken, disconnected, and permanently altered. Medical services were overwhelmed. Field hospitals operated beyond capacity, treating wounds that defied immediate repair. Triage forced impossible decisions: who would receive care, who would be left behind, and who might be stabilized only to die later from infection or exhaustion. Morale in the medical corps mirrored the front, strained by volume, haunted by ethical compromise, burdened by the constant encounter with human fragility. For the German command, the aftermath was uncomfortable and bureaucratically sanitized. After-action reports emphasized progress and eventual success while glossing over the costs. Casualty figures were listed, but the disruption to coordination, morale, and supply chains was largely unrecorded. These omissions were not deception. They were a reflection of an institution that prioritized advance over reflection, movement over understanding. For the Soviet command, the human toll was no less severe, but it was experienced differently. Individual acts of resistance, like the stand at Razinyai, were subsumed into the collective narrative. Recognition, if it came at all, was delayed, vague, and often politicized. The dead remained nameless in most records, their sacrifice measured only in delay inflicted upon the enemy rather than survival or victory. Amidst the physical and moral debris, a profound silence settled. The road reopened, and German units moved on, yet the impact of disruption persisted. Convoys moved cautiously, anticipating further resistance. Units were tired, vehicles underrepaired, and communications frayed. Momentum existed only in form, not in substance. The campaign had accelerated, but it had also been irrevocably altered. Razinyai, once a line on a map, now existed as a composite of human suffering, tactical miscalculation, and the limits of endurance. The broken crew had died, their lives consumed in a short, intense crucible. Yet the consequences of their resistance echoed far beyond their own experience, shaping the trajectory of an entire division and, incrementally, the invasion itself. The battlefield was silent, but the lessons remained, unheeded and costly. Decades later, the road through Razinyai is quiet, bordered by fields that bear no visible scars of the violence once waged there. Yet beneath the soil, the remnants of steel, the fragmentary remains of vehicles, and the memory of those who fought and died endure. Historians retracing the events confront a layered reality. The clash was not defined by the brilliance of commanders or the strength of weapons, but by endurance, circumstance, and the unpredictable consequences of human choice. Modern analysis underscores the significance of the KV crew's stand beyond mere tactical disruption. It reveals the fragility of campaigns built on assumptions of speed and obedience, the dangers of over-reliance on doctrine, and the profound influence of individual acts on large-scale operations. A single crew, constrained by isolation and material limits, was able to distort the movements of thousands, delay supply chains, and expose systemic weaknesses that would echo through subsequent engagements. The moral implications resonate equally. The stand at Razinyai was not a story of heroism to be celebrated. It was a testament to the cost of war itself. Every day delayed, every round fired, every decision made under duress compounded human suffering. Soldiers, medics, civilians, and prisoners, living and dead, experienced consequences that extended far beyond the moment of combat. Historical clarity requires acknowledging these ripples, the quiet human reality that underpins strategic outcomes. Reflecting on this episode also illuminates the human capacity for resilience under unimaginable pressure. The Soviet crew, trapped inside a machine of steel and fire, made choices under the most extreme constraints. They operated within a system in which survival was uncertain, orders absent, and victory improbable. Their endurance shaped events that no strategic map could have predicted. In this, the narrative of Razinyai challenges the notion that war is solely the product of planning and machinery. At the same time, it emphasizes the ethical weight borne by those who wield power in conflict. German commanders, distant from the front line's immediate chaos, made choices that compounded suffering, pressing attacks, enforcing reprisals, and advancing under flawed assumptions. Their decisions remind us that operational success cannot be disentangled from human cost, and that even a victorious advance carries the weight of consequences often invisible in contemporary accounts. In the broader sweep of the Eastern Front, episodes like Razinyai shaped the tempo and experience of the campaign. Delays, miscalculations, and resistance, however localized, interacted cumulatively to affect operational outcomes, industrial mobilization, and morale on both sides. Historians now view such instances as critical junctures, moments when the friction of war revealed systemic vulnerabilities that would later be decisive in shaping the conflict's course. Today, the story persists in memory, scholarship, and reflection. Veterans' testimonies, archival documents, and battlefield archaeology converge to reconstruct the human experience amid strategic abstractions. The road through Razinyai may be quiet, yet its lessons remain. That war is never fully controllable, that machinery and doctrine can be disrupted by endurance, and that the lives of a few can reverberate across the movements of many. The legacy of the broken crew is unresolved. There is no tidy conclusion, no moral certitude, no triumphant clarity. There is only the reminder that history is made in moments of endurance, that human decisions, constrained, imperfect, and often desperate, can shape the course of events far beyond what was imagined, and that every campaign, no matter how vast, is ultimately composed of human lives measured in hours, choices, and consequences. The landscape of memory is uneven. Across Lithuania, the forests and fields where the KV crew once stood silent now host roads, farms, and villages rebuilt in peacetime. Yet beneath this surface lie the traces of decisions made under fire, the imprint of lives compressed into moments of extreme consequence. Modern historians, archaeologists, and military analysts trace these lines with a dual purpose: to understand the mechanics of battle and to reckon with the human dimension that often eludes operational maps. The episode at Razinyai continues to resonate because it embodies a paradox at the heart of modern warfare. A single crew, confined within a damaged machine, exerted influence far beyond its immediate capacity. They halted movements, distorted strategic calculations, and imposed costs that could not be anticipated by doctrine alone. In doing so, they exposed the contingency inherent in all campaigns, the reality that even the most meticulously planned invasion is vulnerable to the unpredictable agency of individuals and the stubborn resistance of circumstance. In examining the moral and strategic ramifications, one cannot separate machinery from humanity. The tank was a tool, but the decisions of the crew were human, calculated, instinctive, constrained by fear and necessity. Likewise, the German response, escalating attacks, improvising under strain, exacting reprisals, was framed by the limits of perception, doctrine, and ideology. Both sides operated within a matrix of human and mechanical interdependence, where every action rippled outward, creating consequences that outlasted the moment of combat. Razini also offers a lens through which to consider the broader tragedy of the Eastern Front. The magnitude of suffering, the erosion of civilian life, the relentless pressure on soldiers and medics alike, and the cascading consequences of operational friction reveal a war that was never abstract. It was a war of endurance, improvisation, and human cost, a war in which calculations could never fully anticipate the chaos of lived reality. In this context, the isolated stand of one tank crew becomes a microcosm, a concentrated example of forces that shaped campaigns, strategies, and histories. Modern reflection insists on complexity. There is no comforting narrative, no singular hero or villain. The KV crew did not win. The German division was not irreparably destroyed, and yet the intersection of their actions had meaning far beyond the immediate tactical outcome. It forces consideration of causality in war. How resistance, however isolated, can generate delays, impose costs, and reveal vulnerability. How command, however confident, can falter when confronted by unexpected friction, and how human suffering, measured in loss and trauma, is inseparable from operational history. Today, the story endures as a quiet, unresolved reminder. The road is traversable. The landscape appears peaceful. But every calculated advance, every measured retreat, every human choice in the theatre of war is haunted by the knowledge that outcomes are never fully determined, that lives intersect in unpredictable ways, and that endurance under pressure, whether by a single crew, a scattered unit, or a civilian population, can shape history more profoundly than strategy or firepower alone. In the end, Razini does not offer resolution, only reflection. Its significance lies in its persistence, a testament to the fragile balance between human will, mechanical power, and the unforgiving arithmetic of war. It is a story of endurance, consequence, and the quiet, often invisible forces that ripple through history long after the battle is done.